Hi everyone, welcome to this video. So I came across this task that shows an animated timeline and we built it from scratch using React. As you can see here, we have a default style here, but when we hover over it, what happens is the colors change and the borders go from dash to solid. And same with the lines, it changes to the blue, which is the active color. And what we want to do in this video is achieve the same result. So let's get started. Okay, so before we get started, if you go onto GitHub in the link below, I have a branch here named Timeline Boilerplate. I've basically installed all of the packages and set up the structure of this project. We are using TypeScript and style components for the styling, and we are also using Yarn. So when you clone the repo, you go here, copy this, and go on git clone in your terminal. All you then need to do is type in yarn or npm install, whatever you prefer, and then this project will be set up. Okay, so now that we have downloaded and installed the project, what we want to do is run this in the terminal, so yarn dev, and then what this will do is it'll get our project started. So if I open it in here, and the port number is 5174, so if I just open that, what we also need to do is delete the unnecessary import, so I'll do that first off. So if we go into main, in here we need to delete the import for index.css. We are using style components, so we have a theme here and a theme provider along with a global style. So if we save all and go into our theme, we then have colors defined. So these are the colors we will be working with in the application, along with a global style here. Nothing too complicated going on here. It's just got everything as a margin and padding of 0. We define some fonts in the background color along with the text as the text color just above here. So if we go into our app here, and then we should see animated timeline here. And we also need to delete the app.css because we're not using that. We again are using style components. So now here, there's no errors in the terminal. If I go into here, we can see the H1 rendering for animated timeline. So first of all, if we go into our completed build, this data here is coming from a JSON file. So what we want to do is create a JavaScript object which has all of this information inside. And then also we will be creating SVG components in React. So these are components that we can pass in a fill color into as well. So the first thing I want to do is create a timeline component here. So let's go ahead and do that. And we also don't need the count variable, which is the default state when we install Vite. So in here, I want to render a timeline component. So what I also want to do in source is create a new folder called timeline. And in timeline, I'm going to create a new file called index.tsx. And this is the component we're going to be making. So it is RAFCE for a React Arrow functional component. And this will be called timeline here. We want to define types as well in this build because we're using TypeScript. So this will be known as react.fc, which is a React functional component, or you could destructure this from React here. So I just need to import this timeline now in here. So control space and then click on that one. And I also want to remove this. So now if I save all and we go into our timeline here, we now have the timeline component rendering on the page. So the next thing we want to do now is to create the object or the data that we can use in the timeline component. So if I go in the timeline component, we're going to have everything contained inside here. But in source, what I want to do is create a new file in here called data.ps. And in here, we're going to create the timeline details object. So it's going to be export const timeline details, which is equal to an array. So we can map over everything. So it's going to be an object that has an ID, it has a title, it will also have an image type, and we also need a alt text. So this is for the image that we render. And finally, the text that we show. So we'll just call it text1 for now. And then we close the array like so. So now if I save, I now have an array with one object inside. So what I want to do is define this type in TypeScript. So essentially, this will be a timeline details type. So what we want to do is create a new folder in source called types. So this is where we keep our TypeScript types. And in here, it's just going to be index.ts like so. And what I'm going to do is create an interface here. So export interface of timeline details, and I'll just call it type. And this is basically what we have in the data here. So I'm just going to copy this and bring it in and then close off the object brackets here. So ID is a number, so we need to define that. And then the rest of them are going to be strings. So we can do Command D and then delete them all and just type in string. This one can be deleted as well. And then all we need to do is do the same for the text here. So now we have a timeline details type. We just need to go back into data and define the type here. So control space, and we import the type from the type folder we just created. But because this is an array, all we need to do is add array brackets here at the end, like so. So now that is all set here. We just need to bring in the correct information now. So if I copy and paste this in, so the first one, it says ID of 1, time of 9 o'clock. The image type is doors open, so we will be using this to render the correct icon that we need for the relevant section on the timeline. So in here, so as you can see, there are different icons. We have the alt text, which is doors are open, and we also have the text of grab a coffee, settle down. So also the next, if we just fix this time here, if we hover over it, it says time is a string. And it says time does not exist on type, timeline detail type. So let's go ahead and go back in here. So we have title. So this should be time. And now if I go back, that should fix it. The next object we want to have is an ID of 2. And this image type is going to be of line. So let's create that. So the second item in the array is going to be this line here. This will be the same for the 4th and the 6th and the 8th. So what we want to do is in our types, we want to make some keys optional. So in here, the ones that are optional are time, alt, and text. So if we go back in here, command and click, so it is time as optional, alt as optional, and text also as optional. So now that corrects the second item in the array. So we want to do something similar for the third item in the array, which is start of the session. So I'll bring that one in here. Similar to the first icon here, which is the ID of 1, 9 o'clock, and then this one is 10 o'clock, start of the session. And if I bring in the rest, so the second line, which is the same as ID of 2 there, and image type is line, so we can access these lines and define the styles for them. The middle one, which is the lunchtime one, does not have an icon, but it has some text inside. So if we paste this in, it doesn't have a time. It has the image type of lunch and the text as lunchtime. So these are the 3 different types of objects we are having in this array, which is an icon one here, a line, and then just the individual text of lunchtime here, which is essentially what we see here in our final build, which is the icon, the line, and the lunchtime here. So what I'm going to do is just bring in the rest of the data here and paste it in. So Command A and V. So now I have everything in here. What I also want to do is import the right type here. So now if I save, what I now want to do is close the types down in here because we don't need them anymore. And the data is now accessible. So if I copy timeline details and go into my timeline component, where it says timeline, what I want to do is I want to get access to the timeline details and command space to import. And then we want to do dot map for each item in the timeline. I want to implicitly return a div first of all, h3, and we want to also close the div off just to see if we're getting the correct data come through from the timeline here. So if I save, I think we don't have the title, we have the text, so we can render that out instead. So we should essentially have 5 or 4 items that have text in, and let's check. So yeah, we have grab a coffee and settle down, start the session, lunchtime, time for pictures, and the end. So what I want to do is essentially create a individual step component which handles all of this information and data inside. So let's create that next. But before I do that, what I want to do is style this div here. So I'm going to call this timeline container, like so. And then I need to create the corresponding styles folder for this. So style.ts, and it's going to be import style from styles components. and then we want to do export const timeline container is equal to style.div, and then we can do backticks now to add styles on. So we want a display of flex, align items as flex dot. We want justify content of space between, a margin of 20px on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right. And then we also want a padding of 2rem. So now let's import this in here and now save all. So all the items should now go into a row. What I also have missed is to close this off with the backticks again. And I also need to save as well. Okay, so now if I refresh, you can see here all of the items are not in a column anymore, they are in a row, which is what we expect and is similar to the final build here. So let's get started and create an individual step component. So what we want to do is, in the timeline, we want to create a folder called components, because we will have multiple components inside. And the first component we want to build in a new folder is the individual step. So let's build that individual. And again, this will take in a index.tsx file, and we want to do RAFCE, and this is called the individual step. And this also is a react.fc functional component. So now let's render the individual step in the timeline. So instead of this div here, we're going to pass in the individual step, and it doesn't have any children, it's just a component. So we can close it off like that and import also. And what we're going to do is have a key of item.id, which is always the case when we map through something in React. And we also want to pass in the data, which is equal to the item. So now all we need to do is receive this data as props in the individual step. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we destructure our props in here and get access to the data, what we need to do is define the props. So what I'm going to do is create a new file in individual step, which is called index.interface.ts. So this is where we would define the interface. So I want to export interface of individual step props, and it's going to be the data, which is equal to the timeline details type, which we also need to import in from our types folder. And then we just close off these props here. So now going back into our index.tsx and paste that in, we also need to import as well. So now if I console log the data and save, just to see if we are receiving the data in the individual step component, as you can see, we're receiving the objects that we created beforehand. We're getting the object, the line, the start of the session, the line again, and also the lunchtime here. So we are getting each object being mapped across. So let's close that down and go back in here and remove the console log. So let's start building out this individual step component. So the first thing I want to do in this div is to render a p tag, which first of all renders the time. So it's going to be data.time, just to see if we're getting the time come through. And then if we go in the build, we can see the times are coming through, but we want to render this in a column. So the first thing is the time, then we need to do a line, then we need to do the icon, then we need to do the text. So let's just map that out in here. So we need a line next, then we need an icon, which is a major part of this timeline. And then the last thing we need is the text. So I can just render that out, which is a p tag data.text, like so. Now, if I save and go in here into our build, we can see something coming to fruition here. We now need to style the containers inside the individual step because they are aligning to the left, as you can see, and we want them in the center, just like so. So if we go back in here, and instead of this div now, what I want to do is create a container. So I'll just call it container, like so. And now in the individual step, we need to create a new file called style.ts. And we could be more specific with this and call it individual step container, but I'm just going to call it container. So export const container is equal to style.div. And then we also need to import styled from styled components. And then in this container, what we're going to have is a few styles. So the first style is display of flex. It goes in a row, and then we want to put it back into a column, which is flex direction of column. We then want to align items centrally. So align item center. We want to justify content as space evenly. We also want to align the text as centrally as well. So text align of center, and then give the color of the text. So the color is going to be from the theme. So we want to get access to the theme.colors.text like so. Or instead of destructuring theme from props, you could do props here and then props.theme.colors.text like so again. Each container is going to be a width of 20%. So we give it a width of 20%. We're going to have a gap of 15px. So that is the gap in between the items here. So the gap between there and there, there and there, and there and there. And then finally, this container is going to have a strict height of 200 pixels. And this is because we can align all the items in the horizontal axis aligned correctly equally. So that is the container complete. So let's import that in to our index. And now if I save all, we can now see everything is aligned in its column here. We now need to implement the relevant items that are missing. So the first item that is missing is the line. So let's go ahead and create the component for that. So what I'm going to do is in my code, close the individual step and create a new folder in components called line. And this takes in an index.tsx as well. And if you do RAFCE, and this is a line. So the pattern is always the same in React, where if we have a set structure like this, which is an index file, a style file, and an interface file, then you can have the same structure throughout the application. It makes it easier to know what you're doing and it gives you a better definition of done. So in the line component, what I want to do is return a styled component called line container. This is where we handle the styles for it. So in line container, we need to go into our styled component. So create a new file in here called style.ts, and we're going to do export const line container, which is equal to style.div. So we also need to import styled components also. And then what this is going to do is going to have a height of 1px. So what I'm going to show you is two ways to make lines in this build, one with a div and another with a HR, which will be the horizontal line we do later on. The width of this is going to be 20 pixels, so 20px. It's going to have a background color, which is going to be the color of primary. And again, we're accessing this through the colors object in the theme provider that we have created already. And then what we want to do is have a rotate as well. So essentially we want to rotate this to 90 degrees so that it is essentially a horizontal line. So now if I save, and we also need to import this in like so. And then what I want to do is in my individual step here, I want to now add the line in so I can import the line component. But what I want to do is wrap it in a div. And in here we have the line component. Now let's see if that's working. So file, save all. So we are having lines being shown here. What we don't want is it showing on the lines that we have going across. So here, here, in the middle, here, and also here. So there is a way to do that. So what we can do is go into our code, and where we have the line, we want to do some checks first of all. So the first check is if data.image type is not equal to line, so not equal to line, and data.image type is not equal to lunch. And if that is true, then we want to return what we have just done here. So bring that in. Otherwise, we want to return null, like so. And then we can bring that in and close it off. And there's an error here, so we need to close the line one here as well, like that. So now if we save and if we check our code now, you can see only the line is showing on the certain sections in the timeline here. So that is the line complete. We also need to do the icons, but that will take more time. What I want to do is create the styles for the text. So I can quickly do that, which is essentially these p tags here. So I'm going to create a style component for this and also for this of both text like so. And then if you go into styles, I'm just going to paste in the style, which is essentially a p tag. It has a height of 10px and a margin button of 5px. So it gives it a bit of space underneath the text. So now all we need to do is import this in and now save all. What I also want to do is create a helper file for the individual step, which essentially handles this for us. So it's more cleaner that way. So if we go in individual step, new file in here called helper.tsx, because we're rendering JSX in here, and we want to do export const handle line, and it's going to take in data. So now if I save, what we can do is command space here for the line, and what I also want to do is cut this out, command X, because some of the functionality isn't correct in the helper. So let's cross-reference this. So if data.image_type is equal to line and data.image_type is equal to not equal to lunch, sorry. So this one has to be like so. Then we want to return line component, and we don't need the else ifs like so. Otherwise, we just want to return null like that. So now if I save, that looks a little better. The data is of timeline type, which we've already defined. And we are also importing the line component here. So we just need to pass in the data now in the index file. So in here, we can render our JSX, and handle line is a function that passes in the data like so. And what we also need to do is import this from the helper. So now that's cleaned up the line section. So if I save all and we check our timeline, you can see it's building up. So the next thing what we want to build is the icon section, and we will look at how to create SVG icons next. Okay, so that's the line section complete. What we now need to do is create the icon. So the first thing I want to do is create a container for my icons. So I'm going to call this icons container, which is essentially a styled component. So now if we create this styled component, export const icons container, which is essentially style.div, and if we double check the styles, essentially it is a display of flex, align items of center, justify content of center, and a width of 100%. So it's taking up 100% of whatever its container is. So we just need to import the icons container like so. And then in here, what we want to do is we want to create a function similar to the handle line function, but in this case is going to be handle icons. And again, we're going to pass in the data in here. So let's create this function. So if we go in the helper, we have the handle line function set already. So it's going to be export const handle icons, which is again going to receive data from the timeline details type. So what I'm going to do is hard code this myself. So this time what I'm going to do is a switch statement. So it's similar to an if check. The statement is going to be the image type. So what we want to do is pass in the image type in here instead of the data actually. So if I pass in image type, which is going to be a string. So essentially if image type is equal to certain cases, then we can render certain UI in here. So if it's the case of, first of all, it is doors open we want to work with. So again, what we can do is if we close everything off, because most of this stuff we don't really need, and in data here, we got the image type of doors open. So if the case is doors open, what we want to do is we want to render a div, and we need to create a SVG component for this div. So we'll create that soon. So first of all, what I'm going to do is render just the text of doors open as a p tag like so. And what I also want to do is close this off, and this here will be an object that we need to pass all the information in what we have below. So now if I save, we have our first case here of doors open, and then the default case is just going to be return just nothing. So we'll have that saved. So now all I want to do is index.tsx is import handle icons, and then we want to pass in the data.image type in here. So now if I save all, we know that the first doors open one is handle. So if we just double check, that is being rendered, and it's not being rendered. So let's just double check why that is happening. So if we go in the helper, what we are not doing is we are not returning anything. So we need to return the div, which is an easy mistake to make. So now we should be seeing it, which is correct here. So now what I'm going to do next is create a SVG component. So in assets, we have a clipboard one already made here. So if I copy this, so Command A and C, what we're going to do is create a new file in assets called clipboard.tsx in here. And how you would do a normal function, we would just create that function. So REFCE as an arrow function. And we have a clipboard, and this is a react.fc. And in our return block, what we want to do is return the SVG text or the JSX in here, like so. We don't need access to this section here. We just need everything within the SVG like so. And you can see it has a defined width and height. So instead of the 800 pixels width and height, I just want to change that. So it's just going to be 100% within its container. So it's responsive then. So if I save that, we now have our SVG component in here. What I also want to do is receive some props. So the props we will receive in this component is the fill. And I want the default color for this, which is going to be white. And you can define this in here like so. So the fill now will be equal to the fill in the path over here. So when we define it, we essentially want the fill in here. So I call it path, but it's fill. And then what we want to do is remove any dashes like this in the fill rule. So it's camel case like so. So now that is the component complete. What I also want to do is I want to type in clipboard props in here. And then we essentially want to define that up here. So export interface of clipboard props, which is a fill of string, which means fill is optional. But if it's not passed in, we have a fallback of white in here. So now if I save, that is the first one complete, and that is how you create an SVG component. So what I'm going to do is bring in the rest of my components in and paste them in here, which essentially is the same as what we have. There is one thing I have missed. So if it is mobile, we could use the media query of max width of 600 pixels, which is coming from Material UI. But in our case, what I want to do is just change these to 100%, which means it will fit its container always. And then what I also want to do is remove this and also remove this. And I'll do the same for the rest also. So that is all of the SVG components complete, and that is how you make the SVG component. What I also want to do is copy this default color instead of the white I defined at the top here. So now if I save all, that is our SVG components complete. Let's just close them down. And then in our helper now, if it is doors open, we want to then render the correct icon. So in our case, it is the timer. So let's, instead of the div, we want to render the timer, which comes from assets timer like so. And then the fill is going to be equal to, and in style components, we can access the colors directly in here. So where the switch happens, before it happens, I'm going to use const and destructure the colors from the theme. So it will be colors is equal to use theme. And this comes from style components. So all we need to do is control space and click that. And then we have access to the colors. And then the fill is going to be colors.icon, which is in the theme colors. So now that is the doors open one complete. We now need to do the same for doors closed. So let's handle that, which essentially is the person component. So let's just copy all of this, but just return the person component instead of the timer, passing in the colors.icon as the fill as props. And we just need to do this twice again. So paste this in. The third case is photo, which is essentially the photo icon or asset in here. And then the final one is the start case in here. So what we're doing is we're looking through all of the image types and we're rendering the relevant icons in here. So this one is the clipboard. So now if I save all, what I should see is all of the icons inside the timeline, which we are now receiving, and we have the default color as well. So what we now need to do is add the borders on the icons. So what I might do is create a wrapper that wraps around each individual icon. So we'll do that next. And then after that, we'll do the horizontal lines. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is shrink these down and add borders around the icons. So let's go ahead and do that. So if you look at the final build here, you got a dashed border first. So let's create that one first. So let's create a wrapper component. So I will create a new folder in here named image wrapper, or you could call it icon wrapper or border or whatever you want to call it. And this is going to be index.tsx, and we want to do RAFCE, and the index is going to be named image wrapper. And this again is a React functional component. And the first thing I want to do is essentially create a div. So it's going to be a container. So we need to create the corresponding styled file. So style.ts export const container, and is equal to style.div. Get rid of that. And we also need to get rid of these because it's just style. And then we want to do backticks. And this container is quite simple. It is a display of flex and a line items of center. Now let's save that. Import that in from /styled. And then we want to do a border. So it's going to be the border. And inside the border, we're going to pass in the icons. So this is a higher order component. So we'll just pass in the children in here. And we want to get these from the prop. So children from here. So we also need to define the type for this, which is going to be named image wrapper props. So I'll just define that here. So export interface of image wrapper props is react.react node, and we can close that off. So again, I need to create an interface file for it. So let's cut this out and do index.interface.ts and paste this in like so. So all we now need to do is import this into our props like so. And then the final thing to do is style the border. So if we create a border style component in styled, so export const border is equal to style.div. And first thing we need is some padding of 10px. We need a border also. So this will be 2px dashed, and the color is coming from the props, which is the border color. So it's going to be theme.colors.border. That is the border complete. We want to make it round, so that will be a border radius of 50%. And what else do we need? We need a display of flex. And actually, let's just test to see if that works. So if I import this border in, and I now need to wrap this image wrapper around the helper, so around the timer, because it takes in children. So let's import that in here. I also want to import it in as well on the rest of the icons. So now it's wrapped across all icons. Let's check if that works in the code. If I do file save all, okay, so now you can see it is working. It's over the icons in here. We just need to remove this semicolon that's been added in. So that is at the end here that we don't need. Save again. So now you can see we have some icons that are round and they have some padding in. So they are contained within its container. So it's not looking exactly like this one, but we can fix that shortly. So the next thing we need to do is add the horizontal lines and then also align the lunch time in the center of the icons also. Okay, so now that we have the icons rendering, what we want to do is create the lines, but I also want to make the icons smaller. So if we go into the image wrapper component in style here, what I want to do is give it a width of 80 pixels. And then when it goes to a mobile device, so at media, a max width of 768 pixels, we just want to drop the width a little bit like so. So now if I save, icons are now smaller, which looks a little bit better. So now what we need to do is create the horizontal line. So let's do that. So in our, if we close this image wrapper down, as we don't need it for now, if we go in our helper, we are looking at all of the cases for all of the icons, but we are not looking at the cases for the line, which is what we need to do, and also the image type of lunch. So in our helper here, we just want to extend further and create a new case. So if the case is line, then what we want to do is we want to return a HR component, which we will create like so. And this HR is going to also have a HR container. So it's a div around the HR like so. Bring that up here. So there's an error because we need to close this off and also define what these are. So let's save. And then in our style.ts, we need to do the HR container first. So export const HR container, which is equal to style.div. So I'll just bring in the styles for this one. So the container will have a display of flex, a line item center, a width of 100% it should be, a margin top of 15 pixels, and when it drops to mobile, then we want to change that to 30 pixels like so. So now if we just fix the spelling on this one, and then we also want a HR, so that is the HR inside, export const HR, which is equal to style.hr. The width is 100%, which is correct, and it needs a border, which is 1px solid of theme.colors.border like so. So now we can close that off. All we need to do is import this from the styled, again like so, and then what I also want to do is if I save all and check to see if it's rendering correctly. So now you can see the HR line is aligned correctly in the middle, and we just need to fix this lunchtime one here. What I also want to do is reduce the size of the image wrapper. So if I go into image wrapper and the container, I'm going to do this as 32 and this as 64. So it looks a little better. And then what I want to do finally is handle the middle section, which is the lunchtime, as you can see here. So let's go ahead and do that. So in our code, in the helper, if we do another case in here, so we can just copy this. Instead of line, this time it is lunch. And instead of a HR container, what I'm going to do is return a component called center text, or you can call it whatever you wish. But this will render a p tag, and this will be text. So now what we need to do is receive that in here. So text is of type string, like so. So then if I go back into my index, I now need to pass in the data.text in here, which is essentially the text coming from the object that we created at the start of the video. So that is coming in as a string. And what we now need to do is create this as a style component. So in here, export const of center text, which is equal to styled.div. And I'm just going to bring in the styles here. So it's a display of flex, align items of center, justify content of center, a width of fit content. We're going to give it a margin top and a height also. We also want to define the p tag inside this div, and we're going to give this a border radius of 45 pixels and some padding. It's going to have a border also of 1px solid, and it's going to be theme.color.border like so. Or actually it will be the primary. Yeah, I'll change this to primary as its text. And then finally in this text, I'm going to give it a display of flex, align item center, height, and a cursor pointer. So if I go back into here, and I just need to import center text from the styled. So now if I save all, I'm getting an error. So let's check what the error is. So type of undefined is not assignable to string. So what I'm going to do is give this an optional chaining in here to see if data is there. Then we want to render the icons text like so. And I'm still getting the error. So what I'm going to do is I could either add or undefined in the type here of timeline details type, or I could use TypeScript coercion and give it the type of as string in here. So now that will fix the error. So now if I save and if we check our browser, you can see here now it's rendering both texts in here. So what we now need to do is remove the timeline text that we had here at the bottom. So we can delete this one. And now if I save, we can also delete the comments because we don't need them. And I can also remove this actually. And now if I save all, we now have a timeline working here. So now we have an error here. So what I want to do is I want to increase the width of the timeline container. So let's go ahead and do that. So at the top level in styled, if we add a width in here of 800 pixels, and now if I save, as you can see, is now fixed. So we just need to move the margin of this lunchtime back down. So we did a margin of minus 65. What we can do is inspect here, and then if we find the div that corresponds with it, so it's not this one, it's not that one, it is this one here. So let's move it down to the center. So if we do 40px instead of minus 65, that should fix it. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the helper file here, we go down to center text, and instead of -65, we just do 40 pixels here and save. So now that should fix the issue and everything should be aligned correctly, which it is. The only thing left is the text at the bottom. So we just need to render that out now. So if we go in here and we just render text is equal to data.text like so, but we also need to do a check first of all, which means if it is lunchtime, then we don't want to render it. So if we go in here, and the easiest way to fix that is do a check in here. So essentially, if data.image_type is equal to lunch, then we want to return null. Otherwise, we want to return the data.text in here. So now if I save all, that is pretty much complete, it looks like. So if we just check, that is complete. So we actually do need to change the margin top back to -65. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the image wrapper styles, so if we search for margin top, there's one of 40 pixels. This one should be -65. And let's check to see if that's working. So now it is working. The only thing left now is the hovering effect. So the way we do that is on a mouse over, and then we set a piece of state to active and we pass that into the styled components. So we will do that next. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is create the hover functionality, and then we have completed the timeline, which is essentially this functionality here when we hover over. So if we go into our code at the timeline component level, so we can just go into here. I want to create some state. So the state is going to be called hover item. So const hovered item and set hovered item, which essentially is React use state of number or null. So we want to pass these in as props into our individual step component. So hovered item equals hovered item and set hovered item equals set hovered item. So we just need to accept these in the props here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're passing in the data, which is correct, but we are also passing in the hovered and set hovered item. We also need to declare the type for this. So first off, hovered item is a number or null, and then set hovered item is a React set state action. So let's go ahead and get the type for that. So the way to get the type for that is if we hover over here and we just copy this, that's all we need to do. So paste that in, and we have the type for the set hovered item also. So now we are receiving these props here. I just want to quickly save. So now we have our state set in here. We're passing it down to the individual step, which means the hovered item and the set hovered item is being received. So in our container, what we want to do is we want to, first of all, on mouse hover, which is an event, we want to pass in an arrow function, and we want to set hover item to true because we're hovering over it. So let's do that. And then when we hover over something, what we want to do is we want to change the color to something else. So the color of the border and the style of the border will change. So we want to do that. So we can pass in the value of hovered item into the handle icons function here. So let me pass in hovered item. And what I also want to do is set the hovered item to the index that I am hovering over. So this index will come from the map itself. So we need to also pass that down into the props also. So in individual step props, we want to receive the index, which essentially is a number. So if I hover over the second item in the array, then that index will be 2 and so on. So if we pass the hovered item and the index in here, so now if we go into the handle icons, I just want to add these in. So hovered item is of type number or null, and then the index is of type number, or we can actually call it ID in this case, like so. So what I want to do is first of all do a check in here. So what I want to do is before we do the switch statement, we want to have a constant. So it is const has been hovered is hovered item not equal to null, which means if it's the original state, and also the hovered item is greater or equal to the ID, which is the index in here. So now we want to do a check. So if we go on to the image wrapper and pass in has been hovered is equal to has been hovered, like so. And now we need to pass this in the image wrapper. So we need to receive it as props. So has been hovered and we also need to define the type as well. So has been hovered is a boolean, so it could either be true or false. And then has been hovered now needs to be passed into the border, because that is what is going to be changed. So if we go in the border, and now this border is expecting props, so the way to define props is like so. Has been hovered is a boolean, so this is how you would define it in TypeScript, or you could put an interface in here. It's up to you what you prefer to do. So now what we can do is we can remove this and change this to the border color, because it's the same. And instead we just want the border width as 1px and the border style as if the props is has been hovered is true. So we can delete this first of all. So has been hovered is true, then it's solid, otherwise it's dashed. So now if I save all and we go into here, if I hover over, nothing is changing, so the functionality isn't working just yet. Let's just double check why that is. So that is because we need to pass in the has been hovered in all of the image wrappers, which we haven't done. So let's pass that in. We were getting TypeScript errors outlining that. And then in the index, so the individual step is not receiving the index, so we also need to pass that in. So index is equal to index. So now if we save all, we should see the image changing, which it has. So now that is working, so that's correct. But when we hover away, what happens is it still is showing as the first index highlighted. So we need to change that. So if we go back in index individual step, so we have an on mouse over, we just need an on mouse out. So on mouse out, set hovered item to null. So back to what it was originally. So now that should fix that. And let's check if that works. So if I hover over, that is working correctly. We just need to do the same for the lines and also the icons. So if we go back into the helper file, the fill this time, so if we go in here, so the fill for all of them now will be different. So it'll be, if it's been hovered, then we will paste in the icons.hovered. Otherwise, it's going to be the colors.icon here. So fill is equal to that. And I also need to do the same for the other ones. Paste that in here. So now if I save all, what I also need to do is add it to the HR line as well. So if I do is hovered in here as a prop equals has been hovered, like so, and then this is hovered is going to be passed into here as a boolean value. Is hovered is a boolean, and the border is 1px solid, but the original color we want is the primary otherwise. So if we do is hovered as well, and if is hovered is true, then we want to show theme.colors.border. But if it's false, we want to just show the primary. So this will be primary like so. And now if I save and we check our code, so now they are black lines. So if I go over them, as you can see now, the colors are changing. So I think that is the solution complete. So now you can see here, when we hover over an icon, which is an SVG component with React, the border changes along with the icon itself, the color. And then when we hover over the line, again, it's essentially taking the index into account, and the same for all of the other ones here. And this is a solution for the animated timeline. Anyways, I hope you liked this video. Please like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.